Is half a dozen an accepted term? I suspect that the parent term is half of a dozen, which is just being shortened to half a dozen. But I caught myself using half dozen earlier today and wondered which of the variants are considered valid. Both half dozen and half a dozen seem odd written out, even though they sound fine to my ear.
I would say that one half dozen, a half dozen, and half dozen are all accepted. However, someone who is more knowledgeable than I will have to attest to whether any of those is actually accurate from a grammatical perspective. This Ingram chart has some interesting findings, however. There are virtually no occurrences of the phrase half of a dozen in the English literature over the last 400 years, while the phrase half a dozen seemed to peak in the early 1900s, decline over the next century, and then pick up again of late. Meanwhile, the term half dozen has seen a similar rise and fall as half a dozen, but with markedly less variance. I found this in Ghana's Modern American Usages entry on half. Half. A half of. The preposition of is often unnecessary. Omit it when you can. See a half dozen and half a dozen. For this noun phrase, either a half dozen or half a dozen is good form. Avoid a half a dozen. When the phrase is used as an adjective, it becomes a phrasal adjective that should be hyphenated, a half dozen twirlers with the band. The OED actually has a full entry for this phrase. The half of a dozen and 6 or about 6. Constant, C dozen. A 1829 L. Peacock misfought. Of Elfin 6 is some half dozen forgers. 1855 Thackeray Newcomb's I7 pointing out a half dozen of people in the room. 1865 Darby Mercury 15 February I might have laid hold of some half dozen at least. Mod. Would you like another half dozen? B. C 1401 Jack Upland in Paul. Poems, A Rolls, A 2. 69 The cloth of a woman might hale half a dozen. 1420 to 1555 C dozen N 1. 1648 Gage West IND 12 He offered unto me half a dozen of Spanish pistols. Ibid 80 Half a dozen Hollanders leapt into the boat after him. 1711 Addison Spect. Number 1. 5 Half a dozen of my select friends. 1843 Barrow Bible in Spain 145 We came suddenly upon half a dozen fellows, armed with muskets. So the phrase a half a dozen has been standard for more than 6 centuries. Use it at will.
In the editor's note to the 1987 edition of the Peterson Field Guides, Hawks, Roger Torrey Peterson writes, "When I was a young man, 50 years ago, my friends and I knew of scarcely more than half a dozen good spots where
Events optional. Weak Lions Sorghum.